This is the New Way We Work from Fast Company magazine, where we take listeners on a journey through the changing landscape of our work lives and explain exactly what we need to build the future we want. I'm Fast Company Deputy Editor Kate Davis. The labor market has been on a bit of a roller coaster in the last few years. From the over 20 million jobs that were lost in 2020 in the earliest days of the pandemic, to the recovery and labor shortages that followed the Great Resignation, which at its peak in 2021 saw 4.5 million workers quitting their jobs in a single month. In 2021 and 2022, the power balance had shifted in a historic way in the employee's favor. With a tight labor market and the new awakening to what was broken in the way we had been working, employees were winning in pay and flexibility, and support for labor unions increased to 71% higher than any time since 1965. But by the end of the year, with worries of a looming recession, the vibe started to shift again. And now, just 2 months into 2023, we've seen layoffs at several major tech and media companies, including 11,000 jobs lost at Meta, aka Facebook, late last year, 18,000 jobs at Amazon, and 12,000 jobs at Google's parent company, Alphabet. So are employees fated to lose all the ground they gained? Is this the end of the empowered worker?
You can't say that the age of the empowered employee is totally over. In some ways, there are certain pressures being exerted upon employees. And in other ways, employees are organizing and thinking critically about kind of what they want in this moment of work. With the pandemic, there's been this real reckoning about, what role work should play in our lives. And you can't unring bells to some extent.
That's Fast Company's senior editor, Julia Herbst. She's the editor of the Work Life section, and she recently wrote an article looking at whether employees are still feeling as empowered and in control of their careers as they did a year ago. Julia and I have been covering these changes in the work landscape closely these last few years, so we wanted to dissect exactly what's happening right now and what it means for what's coming next. I asked her, with the recent layoffs and the possibility of a looming recession, how much has the employer-employee power dynamic shifted? With the constant news of layoffs and the months of news about a looming recession, it feels like there's been a change in the atmosphere around employee power dynamic. Before we get into it, let's do kind of for lack of a better word, a vibe check on how much has the power balance really shifted? What are people feeling right now? What's going on in this weird time?
Yeah, I mean, I think a vibe check. I love a vibe check. I think it's a weird time, right? We're seeing all of these headlines about layoffs. I think there's a lot of fear, kind of general economic insecurity in the air, and, inflation isn't really helping with any of that. That sort of contrasts with the fact that, we've actually added a lot of jobs, more than 500,000 jobs were added in January. And so the US is at a really low unemployment rate right now, but that doesn't necessarily mean it feels that way, I think. And especially certain industries like the tech industry have been really impacted. The vibe you might be feeling sort of depends on what metrics you're looking at, what industry you're in, but I think altogether it just kind of combines to make employees feel like maybe they don't have the power to ask for things that they might have felt they had a year or so ago when, the Great Resignation was in full effect and companies were kind of desperate to retain their employees.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it does feel like a little bit of it, or maybe a lot of it, is not based on data and facts. It's more of the feeling in the air, and sometimes even just the headlines that you see everywhere. So everybody's seeing these headlines of Meta cut 11,000 jobs, Twitter cut this many jobs, Amazon cut this many jobs, of oh God, everybody's getting laid off. For those of us who have lived through and worked through other recessions and other downturns and other layoff cycles, you have that past trauma of, oh God, this is happening again. Contrast that to what we were seeing a year ago, 2 years ago, when it's employees have the upper hand, bosses can't find people to work for them, the Great Recession, everyone's quiet quitting, everyone's resigning. And whether or not the numbers back it up, it's kind of a feeling that, do you feel like it's a feeling that dictates then what people do, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's probably true on both like the employee side and the kind of employer leader side of things. I think we're also in this strange period where a lot of companies are trying to go back to some version of what things were pre-pandemic. So lots of companies are bringing people back to the office part time and some even full time. There have been a lot of announcements of that. So I think in some ways, all of that sort of combines to make workers feel like, oh, like all of this freedom and flexibility that I had during the pandemic, as challenging as it was, and obviously the pandemic is still going on, but like at the height of the pandemic, all of those things are sort of gone now. And, it's back to how things used to be when I didn't feel like I could ask for certain things or, take a break halfway through the day to pick my kid up if I needed to, or, any of those sorts of flexible work arrangements or benefits that companies were kind of rolling out in order to try to entice workers to stick around. All of those are gone now.
I want to dig into that a little bit more of like kind of how bosses are using that to their advantage, the vibe shift, whether or not it's true. But I think we kind of quickly went over something that we wrote a headline about it, recently, like despite what you may think, like it's the strongest job market, the lowest unemployment rate that we've had in 50 years. So we're at this kind of like confusing economic moment, right? It's like all the headlines about layoffs, but yet the job market is actually really strong.
Hmm.
The number is 517,000 jobs were added in January. That's like despite all of the layoffs, that many more jobs were added, and the unemployment rate is the lowest it's been since 1969.
Yeah.
Can you kind of break down why there's like such a misalignment? I mean, we talked about it a little bit. It's a little bit just like the headlines you're seeing. It's a little bit confusing, but like, why is there this like misalignment between public perception and reality?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things are going on. Obviously, like big tech companies get a lot of headlines when they make layoffs, and you don't always necessarily get the context that, many more people were hired in the lead up to this. A lot of these companies had big hiring sprees that they went on before. So even if they've laid a number of people off, it's still like a net positive of people employed.
You're totally right. You don't see headlines like Meta just hired 10,000 people because it doesn't happen in like a giant, they don't hire 10,000 people at once. They lay off 11,000 people at once. And so then that's what you hear. And yeah.
It's also like, the vast majority of workers do not work in big tech.
Yes.
So
yes.
even though, that might be what's garnering headlines, there are a lot more people employed, small businesses and, other types of major companies that just aren't tech. I think another thing, we hear a lot about tech workers being laid off. It's really hard for many of them, but tech workers do generally find jobs quickly. They're highly skilled workers. So right now, even if they're not necessarily being hired by like another big tech company or a tech startup, even, they might be able to find jobs pretty quickly doing tech work in other fields, right? If you're in healthcare, you still need tech workers, right, to support that type of work. So the research shows that tech workers actually find jobs really quickly. They often are well-paying jobs, and then it's actually there are a lot of open positions for tech workers right now. So even though it may feel scary, the good news, I think, is if you are a laid-off tech worker, odds are definitely in your favor.
Those are really important things to kind of underline because you do just see, it feels really scary seeing tens of thousands of people being laid off. But yeah, you're not seeing the other thing, which is the balance, and even kind of tips the scales in the other way, that there's still a lot of open positions, that the people that are being laid off are the types of workers that are, can find jobs more easily. So you wrote in your article that employers are kind of using this vibe shift as leverage to force, for instance, return to office mandates and scale back benefits. Can you talk a little more about like what, kind of maybe opportunistic things that management or leadership is doing right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are like a lot of reasons why employers might want employees to come back to the office. I definitely don't think it's 100% explained by this shift that's happening. But I do think that if there's a feeling that, the average employee is maybe more concerned about keeping their job, it could be easier to entice them to come back to an office setting, or you might not have to be offering, full-time remote, full flexible work in order to retain workers or to entice new people to work for your company. So I think it's definitely happening. And we have seen that there is this sort of gap between how the average employee might feel about returning to office and the average manager or like high-level leader. That, a lot of people want to come into the office with some frequency, but not necessarily, 9 to 5, 5 days a week. Most people want that flexibility. And I think it's hard to unring the bell of having offered that to employees during the height of the pandemic and to say, like, sure, you were able to do your work fully remotely or mostly remotely, but actually now we need you sitting at your desk from 9 to 5. Like, that's a hard sell. And so I think some leaders are sort of using this moment to kind of push for that, despite what their employees are hoping for.
And it's hard to, and we've written about this too, like it's hard to explain or justify it too. If you've done your job for 3 years or 2.5 years or however long remotely and you've done well, we've written about like bosses really have the onus on them, right, to make the case for like why the heck you're in the office. Like, what is the purpose of being there? Not just like doing the exact same work that you're doing at home, but yet you're doing it around other people. The other thing that you mentioned is that there's also kind of a pulling back of benefits, right? So there was a time when it was the Great Resignation and we were trying to entice workers to come work for companies and we were offering them a lot of perks, and some of them, are very eye-rolly, like the free lunches and the mandatory fun and stuff are not, as we've covered extensively, what employees care about. But are there other ways that companies are kind of quietly or not so quietly rolling back the benefits?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's obviously a huge range in terms of what companies are doing. And I think some of them probably are feeling like if you offered something like some type of mental health benefit or some other benefit that you thought was very important in the pandemic, it's pretty hard to roll that back. Employees are going to notice. And, if you thought it was important in 2020, why wouldn't it also be important in 2023? But I do think that there are some kind of worrying signs in terms of, companies feeling like they don't have to offer as many benefits. There's this one 2022 study from the Society for Human Resource Management that I cite in the piece. And it's looking at kind of the reduction of how organizations are offering like additional maternity leave beyond the legal minimum and additional paternity leave. And the study shows that it dropped from 53% in 2020 to 35% in 2022. That's companies that are offering extra maternity leave beyond the legal minimum. And for paternity leave, it fell from 44% of companies offering it in 2020 all the way down to 27% in 2022. So definitely these sort of small clawbacks are happening, but that has a huge impact on, the average employee's experience.
And that's a big misalignment on what employees want. I mean, those sorts of benefits were extended because that is, when we've covered, again, like we've covered it extensively, the things that people want, the benefits that people want, unsurprisingly, are, of course, salary, but also flexibility, paid time off, like those sorts of things. And so obviously companies were smart to add those to entice workers. But yeah, the kind of pulling back of it is really misaligned with what employees want. However, is that sort of thing working? Like so you cite in your article, of course, you reference Elon Musk's authoritarian management approach, which really is like a case study in like how not to be a boss. But, there was also that Wall Street Journal article that you mentioned that, the bosses are back in charge, and it has examples of how like upper management is trying to claim more control. From your reporting, do you think there's this feeling, this vibe of a power shift is genuine, and that bosses, this kind of emboldened position that they feel that they're in, that they can pull these benefits back, that they can force people back to the office? Like, is it working? Do you think it'll work?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's obviously like a full range of employers. So certainly not all employers are reacting to this moment like Elon Musk.
Yes, I know. I don't want to be, I don't want to be like all bosses evil. But, yeah.
Right. But I definitely think that some, folks are going to use this opportunity to exert power. And I think there's, sort of the danger that when there are folks like Elon Musk out there doing kind of the most extreme thing, then other leaders, privately think, oh, look, like he got away with that. I can do like a more modest version of that. Not everyone is rolling out, beds in offices to try to get employees to work,
you must be extremely hardcore.
Yeah, exactly. But I do think it's sort of that type of behavior opens the door for other, problematic behavior from bosses. I was talking with the JP Gounder, and he's a vice president and principal analyst at Forrester's Future of Work team. And they told me that it kind of moves the CEO Overton window, right? In terms of what CEOs might think that they can get away with, right? Or like acceptable CEO behavior. So I think that's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Ugh, yeah, that like he can get away with it. So maybe I can get away with it. Like, less evil version of this. Oh God. But the kind of as like a counterpoint to that idea is also the idea that the power has shifted back to the box. The counterpoint to the idea that the power has kind of shifted back to bosses, or that they can kind of get away with more. You highlight in your piece the increasing support for labor unions. And last year I talked to labor journalist Kim Kelly on the show about kind of the current state of labor unions. And right now we are at like the lowest labor union participation in the last several decades. However, we are seeing the like biggest labor union support. Can you explain why you think union organization efforts at workplaces will play into this kind of new era that we're in?
Hmm. So as you said, interest in joining unions is high right now, especially among, younger Gen Z and younger millennial folks. Like there's definitely a lot of support for it. I spoke with Jennifer Schur, who's from the Economic Policy Institute, and she was sort of talking about the role that unions can play during, periods of economic uncertainty and layoffs. They obviously can play a big role in terms of protecting workers. And also, it's very likely that workers could organize, with the help of a union around topics like returning to work or benefits or any of these sorts of things that are on the table and, where there is a big gap between how management feels about something and, how the average worker feels.
It seems like a counterpoint to, the bosses are back in charge, but it really kind of it goes hand in hand, right? As soon as workers feel that, the benefits that they have enjoyed, or the work environment that they were happy with is either threatened or is changing, that's prime time that employees will start to think about organizing. And it's just a nice little aside that as we're recording this episode, Tesla's workers are working to organize themselves. So it's like Elon Musk's management tactics obviously put kind of that catalyst into their minds as well.
Yeah, that's why I think it's like, you can't say that like the age of the empowered employee is totally over, right? Like in some ways there are like certain pressures being exerted upon employees. And in other ways, employees are organizing and thinking, critically about kind of what they want in this moment of work. I think with the pandemic, there's been this real reckoning about what role work should play in our lives. And, I think I said before, you can't unring bells to some extent, right? Like once people have the flexibility and, the sort of opportunity to make decisions about how they organize their lives, it's pretty hard to take that away, I think.
Exactly to that point, is once employees started to see what work could be, what bosses were capable of giving them, maybe if they offered this benefit, it's really hard to, as you say, unring the bell. It's really hard to take the things back once you have them. Once you've worked from home and done your job successfully, once you've had flexibility and still can do your job, it's hard to just like change it back and say, no, 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 we have to go back to, we say it on the show all the time, like we can't go back to 2019.
Hmm.
It's so weird that in 2023, there are still people trying to go back to 2019.
Definitely. I think like just because you can maybe have more leverage to force somebody back into the office, right? Get them to show up in a place, those sorts of things. Like, it doesn't mean that you're going to have an engaged or productive employee, right?
Yeah.
So I think, employee engagement's still like really important in this conversation. It hasn't gone anywhere.
Well, yeah. And, on the topic of employee engagement, we cover that a lot. We cover burnout, we cover management advice and kind of the future of work all of the time. Where do you think we're going from here from a, employee and management power perspective, but also just how can employees and managers get on the same page? Because it does feel kind of more adversarial right now than it maybe has in the era of the Great Resignation, where things felt like they were maybe moving in a better direction.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would just emphasize that I still think, employee engagement is super important. And that I think if you are a leader and you want a, high performing, successful workforce, you need to be understanding what the sort of pain points are for your employees, how they feel about certain things. And I think to your point, you need to be kind of justifying why you are asking employees to do certain things. So it's not to say like, all companies should be remote. Nobody should ever be forced back into the office or something, right? There are times and places where it makes sense for employees to gather. And I think the data shows that employees are fine with that when it feels like their time is valued and, what they're doing is valuable in an office. So I think it's, whether you're talking about offices or benefits, it's about kind of asking what employees need and, coming up with a compromise that works for the business and for the employees.
And I think it's important too to kind of underline that it's not just like employees asking management for these things and management like deciding to be, nice and give it to them. Employee engagement isn't this like mushy soft thing. It's a very hard business cost item, and we've covered this a lot too. And I think, I'm sure I've mentioned it before. If you have high employee turnover, that's real cost to your business. The amount of money and time it takes to replace somebody. And we've covered before that if you have burnout, if you have low employee engagement, if you're having these things, it's a little less so of, are we going to lay off a bunch of people to save costs? And a little more so of, how the hell are we going to entice workers to come? How are we going to replace them? How are we going to keep them happy?
Yeah, I think morale is like a really important component of that. And I also think, employers need to be thinking about sort of the long-term game. Like, it may be very tempting to lay off folks in the same way that, you see other similar companies doing. Obviously, that's, how these sorts of waves of employment go. But I think, a good leader is thinking in the long term and thinking about kind of how they're going to set themselves up for success, not like 2 months from now, but in the longer term in terms of like keeping, loyal, productive and, engaged employees around.
That's a great point. It's like short-term cost savings. If you're just looking at it from a purely numbers perspective, short-term cost savings of laying off people are going to have a longer-term effect on how you're able to do business.
Yeah, are you desperately going to be trying to hire people, a year from now?
And did you burn up all of your goodwill because you've, created, I mean, that's the thing too. In a high profile case like Elon Musk, like I don't know who wants to work for him, quite honestly. It does seem like the only people that remain either maybe share his ethos or, and we've covered this too, are on work visas and, have no other choice. But is that the sort of, workforce that you want?
Yeah, and to your point about, having the same ethos or something like that, I don't think that's like a long-term sustainable way to build a company if you're only catering toward one type of employee. Think about all of the talent that you're missing out on.
Oh, for sure. If you take a hard line on any of these issues, you're going to take a hard line on everybody must be in the office, you're missing out on talent that lives not in a commutable distance to your office or has other reasons why they can't or don't want to be in the office all the time.
Yeah, working parents, lots of reasons.
People who can't afford to live in New York City or San Francisco. I mean, it's a big group. Yeah. Julia, thanks so much for coming on the show and talking through these topics that we're thinking about and talking about all the time.
Thanks so much for having me.
And that's all for this episode. If you're a new listener, be sure to subscribe to The New Way We Work wherever you listen. And if you like this episode, leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. And we want to hear from you. How have you reevaluated your relationship with work over the past year? Email us at podcast@fastcompany.com or tweet us with the hashtag The New Way We Work. The New Way We Work is produced by Joshua Christensen with editing by Nicholas Torres.